Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today. This is your host Nino Ivanov inviting you to an adventure concerning antique netbooks, just like this Acer Aspire One 722 featuring a 64-bit processor, a AMD C60, and in this case, Windows 7, for there are about 3 versions of older Windows that at present times are of particular interest for machines, like this one. The one being, of course, Windows XP, the other one being, like here, Windows 7, and soon these two shall be joined by Windows 10 once Microsoft drops support for it. And having such an older machine might be an interesting choice if you have old software to run, as I definitely do. And given that setting it up properly took me about 2 days, I would like to just share here for the curious what one might do in order to have a geeky retro netbook. So if you have interests in that, this video might be just for you. And now let us jump in medias res and look at the software I chose to install.
Welcome to Windows 7, and perhaps the first thing one might consider in it, as well as in any version of Windows one might say, is the balance between performance and visual effects. I am always choosing to adjust Windows for optimal performance. Things you might want to leave on is the smoothing of the screen fonts, but many things like transparency, shadows, and so on and so forth are actually superfluous, and this is going to have a great effect on the feeling of the system, how snappy it is. Yes, it does look like a greeting from the 1990s, but it is much more enjoyable to use. To use to do what? So the first thing I want to show you is actually the very screen recorder I am using to create this video. That was a non-trivial task to find something working for Windows 7, at least for me, as there are very comfortable options, but they are only for more modern operating systems. ShareX has been lauded by the reviewers, but one also said that it has the charm of the Millennium Falcon, and I fully concur with that sentiment. It is really full of options, many of which perhaps a little bit unintuitive for the first-time user. Other than that, if you want to do a screen recording and you are not afraid of a bit of an adventure to set it up, then that is clearly recommended. Now the version I am stuck with is 11.9.1, although newer versions for Windows 7 apparently exist. But ShareX necessitates the installation of the Microsoft .NET redistributable, and the last version I can comfortably install is 4.5.2. Versions above that do work on Windows 7, but upon trying to install them, I'm getting a certificate error. Not willing to battle with Microsoft about this question, I just picked this somewhat older version. You will find that on the ShareX website, which is getsharex.com/downloads, and there you can find all sorts of versions from new to old, and as I mentioned, I'm having 11.9.1. So that makes it a version from mid-2017. A couple of other things to note about ShareX is that as it needs for the internal processing of the recording a program named FFMpeg, you will need to install that too, and that also does not work in its full version in its newest editions. So you will need to pick a somewhat older one. I'll come to that question in a moment. But essentially you will need to put the FFMpeg exe into a path which ShareX will helpfully tell you the moment you try to do a video recording. And one non-trivial aspect I would like to mention, but here only on a picture, as if I try now to move through the menus, it is ruining apparently my recording. And that is that you need to turn on the sound for FFmpeg, otherwise you are going to have a screen recording, but unfortunately it will be mute. So here at the task settings, this toothed wheel symbol like Alexander son of Vergina just above this settings symbol with a sort of Soviet symbol. So you go to the son of Vergina symbol, and then you're getting here options, including a record and a record screen. Clicking on a record screen, you are presented with a button FFmpeg options. Going to that, you are having here sources. Screen capture recorder as a video source is completely fine, but the audio source should be your real microphone. And that is what I chose, and that is what you hear. So that is how to persuade ShareX to actually do a recording with sound. That this is a little bit non-obvious is basically my only complaint. Now that we have that question out of the way, perhaps we should talk a little bit in general about Windows 7. For if you install it from a reset to default, as I have here on this netbook, then of course you will get a Windows 7 off the time of the netbook, but by far not with all updates. On chip.de there is a huge update for Windows 7. It's a sum of updates, a 5 GB giant update created by some certain Mr. Thorsten Wittrock, and that is going to bring your Windows 7 system up to speed, up to its newest reasonable version, so that you're not stuck with an ancient variant of Windows 7. And that is of course very comfortable to use, and I'm very happy about that. Now the most common question which I'm reading in forums is, and what office suite to take? The latest officially supported one is Office 2016. I do not know whether Microsoft Office 2019 would run or whether there would be some trickery to do so, but 16 installed without any adventure. Of course, one can always take LibreOffice, and it is certainly the one I rather recommend, but I had the license and I decided to use it. Speaking of document processing, another thing you might be interested in having is PDF Split and Merge Basic, or PDF-SAM. PDF-SAM works in version 3.3.7 and allows you to merge PDFs, cut PDFs, rotate and this extract pages, and so on and so forth. Actually a rather useful tool for office work. One thing which always is a topic is also which browser to use. Now I have opted for my main browser to use something called Thorium, evidently a wordplay on Chromium. And I find it charming because it gives you the vibes of a thorium reactor. At least this is how it feels when you're operating it, as it is quite heavy on the system. It is essentially a retroport to Windows 7 and similar systems of modern Chrome, which I'm very grateful for. Similar to another alternative for a browser, a thing called Supermium, running exceedingly heavily on Windows 7, admittedly having only 2 GB of RAM. So if you do not like Thorium, you might try Supermium. If you like Chrome, both will be equally good choices in their performance on websites. Perhaps Supermium having a few features more, but running also slower, considerably slower. All right, in the topic of connecting to the outer world, things I might yet mention are, of course, Putty and TeraTerm. So these are terminal applications. Not everybody needs that, but just note what you need, note what you care about. And this is an application that will allow you SSH connections, telnet connections, raw connections, serial connections, and in its version 0.82 it is working nicely on Windows 7. A very similar application is TeraTerm, greeting from Japan originally, if I'm not mistaken. That too allows you connections in a similar vein, but is perhaps a little bit more complex to use. That is not going to be ever an issue to install, because it was developed apparently till 2019, well within the reach of Windows 7, so you do not even need to pay attention much to the version, but 4.105 is working just fine. Speaking of other Office needs, people commonly also like to read PDF, not only create it, and here I have chosen Sumatra PDF that is running in Windows 7 in version 3.5.264-bit for me. To not only handle documents, but let's say also simple text, but with syntax highlighting, yes, Notepad++ is working, but not the most modern version, unfortunately, but version 8.7.5. That, however, is working just nicely, and I'm very happy to have that clearly recommended, because you can create tabs, and if I were to close the editor, then all my edits, also my unsaved ones, are preserved. This is something which only the most modern Windows Notepad is able to do. Windows 10 not yet. So Notepad++ certainly makes life easier, in particular if you are dealing with an unstable system. Looking at other common Office tasks, you might wish to create videos. So here the OpenShot video editor is working well too in version 3.3.0. That's a program I'm very fond of, also on modern Windows. And as I have sufficient disk space, who knows, maybe I'll even make this video on it. And one is of course not only making videos, but also watching them. So for this purpose, VLC is working marvelously in version 3.0.21 Vetinari. If you need a competent media player, that certainly would be my recommendation. To edit images, the GIMP is fully operational, though not exactly in a hurry. But GIMP 2.10.22, which is again not the newest version, is working on Windows 7 just fine. If you need an image manipulation program, that would certainly be it. To handle images and documents, of course, also means that you occasionally need to handle archives. And here my choice has been 7-zip in its version 2409 from 29th November 2024. I think that even is the newest. I think 7-zip is so far supporting even the most ancient versions of Windows. Furthermore, not only archives need to be dealt with, but also disks. To write disks, or at least disk images onto USB sticks, which is the most common task, I recommend Rufus, which works on Windows 7 up to version 3.22. I have here the portable version, so that's a reasonably modern Rufus and certainly a very spiffy and friendly program. In its newest versions, it can even make Windows 11 images more normal, like not forcing you to have an online account and so on and so forth. It does that all by itself, and I'm very fond of that. To mount disk images, and this is how I installed my Office 2016, I'm using the Daemon Tools Lite, which is version 4.47.1. I don't see exactly where I can show that to you, but 4.47.1, maybe here, is, yes, is the way to go forward. You will find that in some Daemon Tools archive. Okay, great. So let's close these. And browsing is not the only human need. Sometimes one needs also to get files, not exactly through the web browser, right? And for this, the transmission client, also my favorite on Linux, is certainly recommended. In version 4.0.6. It is working again on Windows 7. Indeed, I should also mention that Audacity is working just as well. This is Audacity in version 3.7.1, which is the one I am now presently about to use. Well, but life is not only work, while life can also be a little bit of amusement, right? So I got here a couple of emulators. Let's say, for instance, CCS64 in version 3.9.3, which I am very fond of. And I am also having not only a Commodore emulator, but of course also a Spectrum emulator, and this is working just nicely. It's called Fuse, and I have opted for Fuse 1.6.0. In the vein of ancient machine emulators, there's also Virtual T, which is emulating the Kyocera 85 class of machines. This is an important machine class because allegedly it was, once upon a time at least, Bill Gates' favorite, and the last type of machine, more known in the US as the Tandy TRS80 Model 100, for which he himself wrote software. So Virtual T is the emulator, and in version 1.6 it is working on Windows 7 just nicely. I do of course also like to have an Apple II emulator. Here I went for Apple Win in version 1.30.20.0. And as I mentioned, communications, there might be two other programs that I should make mention of. One of them being CKermit for Windows. Kermit is a very well-known communications program which has been in existence since the early 1980s. Its development is continued nowadays on a website called kermitproject.org, and while its newest release is available only in a beta version, I have had no issues with it and I'm very fond of it. So version 10 beta 11 for Windows 6, whatever this is called, I thought it was the 6th beta. This is why I'm a little bit puzzled, but that is working nice. So if you see a CKermit Beta 6, just go for it if you need this communications program. It's rather specific, but I can tell you one thing it can do better than anyone else: cross-media communication. That is, if you are having a machine with a serial port and a machine with a network connection, and you somehow manage to connect this network connection to that serial port, then the two machines would be able to communicate over Kermit with its protocol and exchange files and you name it. Speaking of which, who would do that? And how would you do that? To connect a serial connection with a TCP/IP connection, you can use something called the TcpSerialBridge, available on SourceForge. And that does exactly that. I am very fond of it. It makes the weirdest experiments possible because it can get things across to be controlled in fashions that have never been meant to happen. So the TcpSerialBridge is certainly something which is a very fun toy if you are into communications. But I have not maybe finished entirely my emulation discussion, for yes, of course I have DOSBox. Just I opted for DOSBox X in the version 24.12.04. In other words, a very modern version of it, which is also operating on the Windows 7 without fault, at least what my superficial examination is showing so far. Now, one of the reasons I ever even bothered doing this whole thing has been, like with Windows 7 and so on and so forth, is the Sun Wireless Toolkit, nowadays owned by Oracle, in version 2.52. Beware that there is a version 3.0.5, but version 3.0.5 does not seem to work on Windows 7 at all, whereas 2.5.2 seems to be working just fine. You need that if you wish to create applets for old mobile phones, which still could run so-called Java midlets. If you get that, and Java 8 also nowadays from Oracle, you will be able to create programs for antique phones. I continue to be exceedingly fond of this facility. Very well. Then now that we discussed browsers, there's perhaps one more thing I should mention in this regard. I got the Tor Expert bundle, you know, the Onion router or router in version 0.4.8.13. It is working just nicely, and you can use it as is as a SOCKS 5 proxy on localhost port 9050 if you can direct your browser to it, or you can try in some Tor RC file to set up an HTTP or HTTPS proxy. I had trouble with that. For some reason, the Tor Expert bundle for this version comes without a Tor RC, and no matter what I was saying, it was crying that the Tor RC file is malformed, that it's not taking it, and so on and so forth. In the end, I somehow managed to do this, then the browser started to cry. So I finally opted to just go for the SOCKS 5 option. And that works nicely. So that is the one where you need to set up nothing on port 9050. Speaking of emulators, I should perhaps also mention that my DOSBox X build is using SDL2. And furthermore, that on the website shorn.ch by a gentleman called Peter Shorn, you'll find a lot of amazing stuff, but certainly one of the things I am most fond of is his Altair Z80 emulator, which is coming pre-packaged with all sorts of software and goodies, and if you want to experience CP/M, that certainly is the way to go. Regarding programming languages, he is offering very nice options for CP/M. And not only is there, the usual suspects like BASIC, there are also weird things like Ada and Algol, weird from nowadays perspective. You see there's a whole category of stuff he's offering, but I believe most interesting is, where is it? Prolog Z. So that is a Prolog development environment, the logical programming language, that is working on CP/M and which is most amazingly rather syntax compatible with more modern Prolog standards, because there are other Prologs for old systems such as Mini Prolog and so on and so forth, which are having a bit of a Lispish syntax, whereas Prolog Z is working splendidly the way you're used to using Prolog. Okay, I know that's ludicrous, but an absolutely admirable feat. Now, we are, as you notice, perhaps proceeding a bit towards the more geeky part of the video. And it's time that we talk about a command line application in general. I am fond of something called Yori, and Yori in its present version is working on Windows 7. And the nice thing about having Yori is that you're getting tools that you would normally miss, such as which. You see, this is part of Yori. The other thing you're getting is Yedit. So this is an editor, not unlike what once upon a time was delivered in the MS-DOS subsystem of systems like Windows 95 and 98, and which I admit I liked. So Yori with its goodies is a very nice choice for a command line application. That, of course, is not actual programming, right? Actual programming involves programming languages. And what was sort of annoying me was that the last official version of Python was version 3.8.0 for Windows 7. And if you wanted anything newer, there's no official support, but there is this good GitHub repository of null-ash, CPython called, which is offering here a release from December 2021 of Python 3.10. That's not terribly modern, but modern enough for a lot of things that I wanted to have. Missing, of course, a couple of things, like a simple audio is not available, but I went here for the full version, which is containing pip, this Win7 full. And I could install things. Unfortunately, there is no such thing as simple audio, which I need for some of my experiments. Not pip simple audio, pip install simple audio, so you just witness what happens when it doesn't work. Right, that does not work. Maybe it's taking too long and I'm not in the mood of waiting. So simple audio does not work, trust me that. But I could install in the same way something called PC Basic. And I mean, owning a computer which does not offer that facility is a little bit like the question, why would you even have a computer if it does not offer such a basic interpreter of most primitive nature? So I love this. You exit with system and you can have that on Windows 7. You might note that I'm going for a lot of such simulation and historical application type of things. The reason for that is that no matter how old this machine will one day become, these things will always remain usable. A C64 will always be a C64, a Spectrum remains a Spectrum, and yes, PC Basic will give me the feeling of the days of old. Now that is, of course, not our only programming language, though I should maybe show it in its full glory. So this is what Python 3.10.1 looks like, and I don't know, print hi there. This is operational, and you can have that. You can also have idle if you so very much insist on it. I admit though that I somehow like rather to edit my stuff in Notepad++ and just run it in Python rather than to edit it in Python. Continuing the topic of development tools, I chose as compiler Fabrice Bellard's TCC or Tiny C compiler, available on bellard.org/tcc, which even in its newest version here is operating on Windows 7 flawlessly and can be easily run from the command line. Now, Bellard mentions himself that there is the LCC compiler as well, which you might try as an alternative. I even opted for the BusyBox for Win32, which built just fine. So you can go here for the version of 0927 without another thought. Of course, another popular programming language is Java, and regarding Java, I opted simply for Java 8, the JDK. And knowing me, you will not be surprised if I told you that I got perhaps more than one Lisp. So I got SBCL, which does not work on Windows 7 in its newest version, but in version 2.4.11 it operates just nicely. If you opt for GCL, then the newest version 2.6.1, created in 2003, unsurprisingly runs well enough. We also have here Clozure Common Lisp, which poses an interesting challenge, as version 1.12 still works under Windows 11 in every fashion, and that would be the version I chose. But version 1.13, so to say the next version, does not work under 64 bits in Windows 7, but does under 32. So the question is, do you want to have the 64-bit version one version older, or just the 32-bit version but one newer? So these would be my 3 Lisp environments. But Lisp is not the only programming language, right? For we need also to have Prolog. In practical terms, SWI-Prolog in version 9.2.9 is typically my weapon of choice, so this is what I got. You know, before getting out, we can say something like assert that man Socrates, and then we can say man who, and then we're getting Socrates. So yes, SWI-Prolog is working nicely. And I got, you know, I'm Bulgarian, and there is a Bulgarian Prolog called Strawberry Prolog, light edition, that essentially a remnant of the late 90s, early 2000s, is working under Windows 7 nicely as well. So version 1.02 by Dimitar Dobrev That is just a question of taste, of course. But no development facility would be complete without a serious basic development environment. And here I opted for QB64, which is presently not available as of making this video in a 32-bit version, but the 64-bit version is working nicely on Windows 7 QB64 version 2.1. So that is, so to say, an imitation of the QBasic programming environment, and it is syntax highlighting. Like if I were to say print, you see how it changed its color. If I take the T away, then it's not a keyword. So that's actually very powerful and very pleasant to use. That is as far as the development environments are going. But before we jump into the ham radio details, just a couple of honorable mentions of other applications. So the File Manager is working in version 3.0.57, but I think that's an antique version which I just had lying around somewhere. As you can see, that's a Norton Commander clone that I am admittedly very fond of. And another thing I might recommend you to get, but you have to get it from elsewhere, from some file archive site, in version 5.4.3, and that is the Revo uninstaller. So a tool which is helping you remove rests of applications whose uninstallation went awry. Then there are a couple of tools concerning Tor, and just placing them here for the record, although I myself did not actually make use of them. The one is Torifier, the other one is Resistal, and the third one is Proxy Chains for Windows. So basically, in one way or the other, all of these tools have in common that they try to channel traffic. And if I'm not entirely mistaken, there was even one more. Yeah, SoxCap64. So there are tools similar to what you would do with TorSox on Linux, but I could already see here that I have used some version 4.7 or something. And now let's look at the ham radio, specifically Morse operation software. You see, I wanted something simple, something like CW, like for continuous wave on Linux. And it turns out there are so many completely trashy projects, some demanding tens of euros in payment, you know, for tasks like encoding letters into beeping. And long story short, researching this entire community, I came to the conclusion that the hams are intelligent people who are extremely enthusiastic and involved in radio operations, but they are by far not necessarily computer savvy. And a lot of the tools they are using are like, I got something from 1992 and I'm still using it. And that is what the Windows world looks like. Paid, cheap trash and free programs to shovel away through them a path to something reasonable. Reasonable appeared this utility Matta, also antique a little bit, but thankfully running on Windows 7, which is able to operate on text files and wave files. So you're not having immediate interaction with the outer world, but you need to have files. It looked as one of the more mature projects. And this tab, I'm being presently informed, is using 142 megabyte of my precious memory. Wow. And if you prefer things more interactive, somehow the only equivalent to CW which I managed to find was jmorse from SourceForge. This is a Java application into which you can pipe text, or on whose command line you can give text, or which you can start and then you give text until you press enter and then it transmits it. But it seems to be transmitting at a fixed rate and with a fixed pitch, like with a fixed frequency. So that's mightily inflexible. For listening, multimon-ng has been ported to Windows apparently several times, and this one in the repository C0NE, perchance to be read as cone, this multimon-ng 1.1a for x64 seems to be working for me. I have not yet been able to decode anything, but I have not been able to do some special setup. At least the application seems to be running. Then a rather complex application, one of the two most classical ones in these terms, would be WSJTX. You know, everything in this ham world looks like keyboard mashing. Their handles looked as if their head hit the keyboard, and they're mightily proud of them. So you see, who made this? Is this some random encryption code? Anyway, WSJTX is an excellent piece of software. These people are brilliant, but they're just brilliant in another field, and they are having their own idiosyncrasies which an outsider really needs some getting used to. And perhaps the most classical piece of software in the field, regardless of the operating system, would be Fldigi, which in some form exists even for Android. And it is working just fine because, you know, they are creating regular releases, but somehow they are not trying to get terribly in your way. And I am having here exactly this version 4.2.06, which they're advertising here, and it is newly made in 2024. You see, in October of 2024, and it is working just nicely. So closing here finally Thorium, I am presenting you with Fldigi. So this is what it looks like in practice. You pick here, for instance, your mode that you might be interested in, CW being continuous wave, and then you can write here in the lower turquoise half something like, "Hello, my dear viewers," and it will morse it out if I now press here TX. That is the sanest option you can pick in terms of ham radio software for the beginner in Windows, in my opinion, and to my knowledge. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for today. I shall close here Fldigi. And we are back to ShareX. I hope you otherwise enjoyed this adventure, and should you wish to set up an old netbook with Windows 7, I hope you found that useful. I hope to greet you here soon again for further adventures. If not subscribers yet, please consider joining our friendly and curious club. Until we meet again, have a wonderful time. Thank you for watching, and from me, goodbye.